Hey, I'm Isabelle from Sweden.
And I'm Loukina from Switzerland.
We started to be active in the Fridays for Future movement in December 2018, and since then, our paths have crossed several times. The first time was at the European Parliament in Strasbourg. The second, at the Fridays for Future Europe meeting in Lausanne. And most recently, we met at the World Economic Forum in Davos.
So the idea of this video is to share some key points on our perspectives on youth activism, the climate crisis, trees, natural-based solution, and the question around individual/collective action. So yeah, we hope you will enjoy the video and that you will learn something. If at any point you have any comments or any questions you would like to make, feel free to use the online tool to chat directly with us. We would love to get a bit more interactive and in touch with you, so feel free to do that and enjoy.
So, as you might have guessed, Loukina and I are climate activists, and we've chosen to dedicate so much of our lives to this because of the climate crisis. The climate crisis is an incredibly complex subject with lots of factors that play into it. But since we're just going to talk a bit about the basics of the climate crisis, I think we'll start with the temperature rise. So in talking about temperature rise, we often hear statements like, the 5-year period from 2016 to 2020 is expected to be the warmest on record, with an average global mean surface temperature of 1.1 degrees Celsius above the pre-industrial eras, which is 1850 to 1900. Or, human activities are estimated to have caused approximately 1 degree Celsius of global warming above pre-industrial levels. Or maybe even, if we continue on this trajectory, we may surpass a temperature increase of 3 degrees Celsius by 2100. But what do these temperatures mean?
Well, the rise of the temperature has an impact on the whole Earth system. Back in 2015, after that COP21 agreed on the Paris Agreement, they invited the IPCC, which is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, to provide a special report in 2018 on the impacts of global warming of 1.5 degrees. So in the summary of the report, we learned that obviously a temperature rise of 2 degrees is having more impact than a temperature rise of 1.5 degrees. And on some systems more than on some others. Biodiversity, acidification of oceans, extreme weather are all expected to be worse at 2 degrees. And let me show you a figure. So it's the SPM 0.2 figure that personally helps me to understand better what is the situation like. So if you look at it, you can clearly see that it's getting worse at 2 degrees, especially for warm water corals, the Arctic region, coastal flooding. And we can easily understand and draw as a conclusion out of it that, well, we have to try to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees because it will have some significant impact and less damage on ecosystems, biodiversity loss, and human system as well. So this report really put into place what is at stake, what is the difference between 1.5 and 2 degrees. And if you go and read the summary, you see it's pretty clear.
Great. Now that we have established what some of the consequences of global warming are, let's talk a little bit about what's causing it and where those emissions come from. The source that contributes the most to the greenhouse gas emissions is energy usage and the fossil fuel industry. The sector that is the second largest producer of greenhouse gases is agriculture and land use. And another industry that is famous for its carbon emissions is cement production. So, what can we do about it? Many scientists talk about a carbon budget to meet the 1.5 degrees Celsius threshold. Based on calculations by the IPCC, we can only emit roughly 300 billion tons of carbon before we hit 1.5 degrees. It sounds like a lot, but it's only a fraction of what we have already released into the atmosphere. And that if we continue the way we are now, we only have about 7 years until we reach 1.5. And we have to do everything we can to avoid that. which means we have to immediately start decreasing and halting our emissions. Every ton, every kilo of carbon counts.
And it isn't even enough. We also need to capture CO2 in order to go down to 350 particles per million in the atmosphere. And there are some natural climate solutions which are very simple, growing by themselves, and not expensive. Trees. So trees can absorb a lot of CO2, the way they function. I'm not going into tree chemistry process, but they can absorb a lot of CO2 and help to fight the climate crisis. So we should start to restore ecosystems and reforest. However, it can only make sense if in the first place we stop cutting trees and the forest.
When I was growing up, this area used to be one of the places where me and my sister and my dad would pick the most mushrooms. So it was one of the best places that we had where we could go. I remember once when I was 8 or 9, we managed to pick this huge basket just full of mushrooms. And it's just sad to see it gone and chopped down. I don't know if you can hear it in the video, but in the distance you can hear the sound of vehicles putting out warning signals for when they're cutting down the trees and taking them away. It's like just over that hill. You can see the tracks from the tractors that take away all the timber. So the forest looks quite different now from when I was a small child, which is quite sad.
Also, we shouldn't fall in the greenwashing thinking that we can run business as usual and keep emitting as much as we do as usual, and we just plant trees to compensate our dirty business, because it just doesn't work. We really have to think, what do we do to stop emitting in the first place, and then also look at the natural solution to help the climate regenerate. Because also we would need a huge, enormous amount of trees to compensate the huge amount of CO2 we are emitting. And also trees take time to grow and to store carbon. And there are some initiatives going around about planting trees, and who are aiming to plant a lot of trees. But I wonder, is it as simple as that? Just planting trees?
Actually, there's some stuff we need to keep in mind. We need to reforest and restore ecosystems, not only plant trees and plantations, like most carbon offset initiatives do. Initiatives that have received a lot of attention are the Bond Challenge and the so-called 1 Trillion Trees initiative that was announced at the World Economic Forum in Davos earlier this year. Both these projects focus mainly on tree plantations, and these tend towards being monocultural, rather than reforesting areas with true biodiversity. Projects like these are marketed as being our solution to the climate and environmental crisis. However, according to a study in Nature Sustainability published this summer, they can cause massive damage to local biodiversity and not actually contribute that much to mitigating the climate crisis. That is why, when planting trees as a natural climate change solution, it must be done as a restoration of ruined ecosystems and the reforesting of areas that once were forests. Since reforesting on other types of areas, like grasslands or peatlands, will also reduce the important biodiversity those biomes contain.
Indeed, planting trees is one solution, but have to be thought through to be effective and to not damage ecosystems nor have a negative impact on local communities.
Oh, hey! So we were just explaining all of these facts and thinking on what we know on a scientific level, but actually it's a bit overwhelming to know all of that. So now should we have a discussion on what can happen on your own individual level, and what can you do collectively together to take some action against the climate crisis? Because obviously you won't just stay in your bed and just being desperate about the whole situation, because I mean that might also happen, but hopefully we find some energy to do something. So individually speaking, what can you do, or what are you doing, or what have you heard one can do for limiting the climate crisis?
Well, I think what is the most important is to realize, that we should just do something. We shouldn't just sit in a bubble and be like, oh, I can't do anything that will make a change, because then no change will happen. We have to realize that even the smallest things we do will add up. But we do have to realize that as long as we are only relying upon individual change, we won't see the structural and systemic change that we will need to figure out the climate crisis.
Okay, so if I understand well, I can do my own small little things on my corner, which is adding up to the whole effort to move in the right direction. But I should also find another way of getting active, which will have a bigger impact if I join forces with others. So how do you do that? What sort of collective action one can take, or what does make sense to do?
Well, I mean, if you don't want to start by doing demonstrations and going to school strikes, for example, like we do, then you can make changes in your own personal life, like eating more plant-based, stopping flying as much and taking trains instead. But when it comes down to it, if you are above 18 and voting in elections is super, super important to make sure that the people that are in power are the ones that are more inclined, at least, to tackling climate change. But also just going outside and demonstrating and making sure that your voice is heard and putting pressure on these politicians so that they have the knowledge and the ability and the backup to make the changes that we need to make is super important.
What are the ways that I can put pressure on politicians? Because it sounds a bit abstract. When you don't have political understanding or you don't know much, what are the things one can do if it's not straight organizing a strike?
Yeah, it is very, very abstract, I think, a lot of this. And some of it can be online campaigning, some of it can be sending emails into politicians' offices or calling them and asking them to act according to the science. And you can, of course, recommend them that they read the IPCC reports, actually do that. But it can also be as simple as going outside and doing a single strike, just like Greta did when she first started striking. Or it can be getting a group of friends together and organising a demonstration that you advertise online and hope lots of people come, which of course is a little bit more complicated now with COVID-19, but you can plan for the future as well.
So I guess what is important is when we start disturbing, because when like movement sort of arise when structures are being shaken and start like feeling a pressure from the people and from the whole situation in the world, I guess. Okay. Yeah, that sounds like first steps to take. And I mean, we've also talked together about when we were at the VEF or when we've been meeting with some politicians, that every time you go out of a room, you have this very sort of powerless feeling that nothing there is going to happen. There is no radical actions inside or in the horizon. So I'm also thinking from that we should also start moving ahead of politics, like all politicians, because at the moment they are not responding correctly to the crisis, as they are not even treating it as a crisis. Therefore, we should also, or in those collective structure we organize as a group, as a movement, as anything really, to start also building those structures which are allowing us to live sustainably, and which can give a space to refuse or not accept anymore the destroying of biodiversity and nature, because at the moment we are not able to stop that. It's still happening the way things go. And I mean, individually speaking, you can't do a lot about it. You can sign petition, you can do this stuff, but I think we also desperately need to come up as a society and say, okay, this we want for the society, this we don't want, and put back values on things which actually matters and have value nowadays in terms, like in a context of a climate crisis / a pandemic happening at the same time. Yeah. I don't know if you want to add something about that.
Yeah, I think it is very, very complicated, and we do need to come together as a movement and as a people to move forward as much as possible. But we also need to remember and think a lot about the privilege it is to be able to live sustainably in how society looks right now, because the system is in favour of those who are rich and are emitting the most, and not in those who are emitting the least and don't have a lot of money or don't have a lot of time, which is why people like us should try to do as much as possible and use our privilege to make the change needed and to adapt our lives as much as we are able to, but never gatekeep our activism and never judge people who don't have the same privileges as us and don't have the same abilities as us to do this, because the climate crisis affects everyone, but it will affect us the least.
Yeah, so maybe we should just add that we are talking from a European white woman perspective in that whole discussion. And of course, it's very different than people who are already facing the climate crisis right in their communities. And yes, we should always keep them in mind when we think about what solutions we are willing to bring or what actions we are starting to take. It's the whole climate justice principle, basically, to keep in mind. Cool. Yeah, I think, what do you think? I feel sometimes people say to us, oh, you are being so hopeless and you are not bringing us any hope. But what is your own opinion on ourselves with that question? Because we might sound a bit, negative and sad.
I don't think we're being negative, though. I think we're being realistic. We've seen a situation in society and we see that our politicians aren't acting, and we realise that, hey, we're not going to manage to get out of this crisis unless the politicians act according to the science that exists. And I don't necessarily think that's negative or hopeless. I think that is being realistic and understanding the situation. However, I do really, really, really hope that our politicians do realise everything in time and act, even if it is quite unlikely. But that is why we need to keep putting pressure, and that's why we won't give up. We are determined and we won't give up. We will continue doing what we can until our politicians act.
And we need you who is watching that video, and we need everyone who can act with us and do something about it, because there's a lot of energy to move and to bring into that fight, because it's a fight for all living species on the earth. And yes, it's, I think the more realistic you are about the situation, the best you also feel somehow, because it's not that we are living in lies or living in weird illusion of some bright future which at the moment doesn't really exist. So I think it's also giving you a lot of energy and hope when you're willing to build up that future which is needed for our generation and every generation to come, and also the one living at the moment who's already impacted by the crisis. So yes, take action.
Yep, we are acting in solidarity for those already affected, which includes the people in the most affected areas, and Indigenous people a lot as well.
hele hele la la go, 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 hele hele la la go.
So I guess we need to conclude this video now at some point. It's getting quite long, I think. And we hope that you've had a good time listening along to what we have to say and hearing our discussion and enjoying our discussion in the chat as well. And yeah, Loukina, do you have any concluding thoughts?
I hope we could give like a first insight or taste about what we have in mind when we think about the climate crisis and what is there in the best science we have at the moment to understand the whole world, like situation on the climate. So it's from now on, we pass it over to you. It's your choice. Where do you stand? If you stand by fighting with us against the climate crisis, and you don't have to be perfect in your own life to do that. You don't have to be vegan. You don't have to never fly. The best is that you do the best you can on your own, like wherever you stand, and that you choose this side and you don't choose the side of ignoring and just living by as if it doesn't matter, because it's a very huge topic and we really need every single brain to think about a solution to solve it. So please make this decision the best you can. And yeah, I just send you a lot of energy and good vibes for acting, because it takes a lot of also engagement. So I'm sure you can find that in yourself and or in your surrounding. Look around for what inspires you to some extent, but also remember that it's a bit of a moral dilemma. From the point you are not ignorant anymore in the situation, you have a moral responsibility to act upon what you know. So yes, but I'm sure you're gonna be great in what you do, and thank you so much for listening and for having us on here. And yeah, Isabelle, do you have anything else you'd like to add?
No, I think you concluded it very, very well. Let's go out and be activists and demand our politicians listen to the science.
Yes, time left.